direct ratio of acres to lots. Essentially, as you get a larger and larger lot, your yield, the ratio changes. So essentially, sort of for 10 acres, you could potentially get 2 divisions there. But then it would require 20 acres to get to 3. I'm just making the numbers up here, but and then it would take 50 acres to get to 4. So essentially, as you get that larger and larger lot size, your yield, it doesn't decrease, but the density of it does decrease, if that makes sense. The goal here is essentially to try and keep the larger lots where possible, because also within that sliding scale, as we mentioned, for those parcels that are over 30 acres in size, 85% of that lot has to be maintained in one parcel. So essentially you cluster all the other ones, but you keep one large parcel, so we can help to try and preserve that rural countryside, those large, hopefully agriculturally viable parcels as one lot, and don't see them subdivided off into a 20-acre McMansion, 20-acre McMansion, 20-acre McMansion. We'd much rather see essentially a 50-acre farmette and then 3-acre parcels, or whatever the case may be. Go ahead and I'll come back to you.
It sounds like agricultural and forestry district term easements are kind of the worst of both worlds, because the county forgoes receiving tax revenue from it only for it to be potentially developed in 8 to 10 years. Is that the case?
Yes, to some extent. Essentially, it's a state code provision, but the intention of it is essentially to allow these areas to congregate and to see a like interest of agricultural producers or forestal producers that can be weighed upon and can be considered by the Board of Supervisors in land use decisions. So essentially, you have to have a critical mass of at least 200 contiguous acres to form an ag and forestal district. And so that essentially, by accumulating that and declaring and going through the process of becoming ag and forestal district, you're indicating to the Board of Supervisors that this is an area that has an interest and is primarily dedicated to these land uses. And so the board is then required, as a trade-off, to take that into account when making land use decisions, as well as things like infrastructure decisions, so roads and things of that nature. So, it does limit the county in terms of, does it enable these parcels to qualify for land use taxation, but I think it also helps to, particularly here in Fauquier, where we have a very, very robust ag and forestal district program relative to the rest of the Commonwealth. It helps to landowners to very clearly give themselves an identity as embracing the rural character, embracing that ag land use or that forestal land use. So, from a strictly number standpoint, it may be somewhat problematic. But I think, again, as we tighten up the barriers to entry and are ensuring that these are legitimate parcels that are either have prime ag soils or are actively engaged in agriculture or forestry operations, it really will help to benefit the county and help to benefit that rural character and that rural agricultural economy.
Yeah, going back to the 85-15 that you mentioned in the previous question, on the subdivision, 85% having to be open and 15% is where the majority of the lots go. Is there any, are they revisiting that as how that can happen? I mean, I've seen many of these, not too many, I don't know what that would be. I've seen a lot of these where what ends up happening is the larger tract is on the inside of the property, and then the developed lots are on the road frontage. In essence, blocking the view that you were trying to preserve with this whole thing in the first place by keeping open land. So you end up really kind of shooting yourself in the foot with that.
Right, yeah, you almost end up strip residential along the road frontages and
right.
Preserve lands.
Is there any, I mean, are they looking at that and how to limit that?
It's been talked about internally, but again, the devil's in the details of how you write an ordinance, and we haven't been able to come up with any way to get around that problem. The way that it's written in the plan, and it's ideally situated. The ideal way that it's described for these to take place is essentially looking at the land and identifying where the sensitive lands are, and there is the requirement that all of the environmentally sensitive lands and all of the natural resources are within that 85%, that larger parcel. But it often ends up that they are still able to work it so that the density occurs along the road frontage. And from a development perspective, there's a benefit to them to do that because they don't have to create the road access themselves within the parcel, so there's a cost savings.
But in that instance, wouldn't it have been better to, forego the 85-15 rule and split it into whatever parcels, preserving more visual open space access?
It's tough because what you potentially would then wind up seeing are just simply the McMansions along the road of 20-acre parcels, and so it doesn't necessarily get you any better off. In this instance, you at least still have that viable parcel for potentially a farm and agricultural use with the 85% in the rear.
I think what Amy's trying to say is that one of the purposes of the 85% rule is because if you have a large area, the 85%, we have preserved that for agriculture somewhere down the road. Maybe not today, but 20 years from now, we still have it, because once you lose it to the 20 acres, you lost that as agriculture forever. That's what the hope is.
Right.
So,
The number of
it's hard to get there.
Well, I understand the theory, and the theory works really good on paper, but in reality, it kind of messes things up in many instances.
I agree with that, but the bottom line is we still have the 85% that's, available, hopefully at some point, is kept in balance.
Yeah, it's got that non-common open space easement on it, so it's got to be preserved in its entirety.
There's a balance. You can't get
And that's usually the steep slope and
Yeah,
the
well-
rocky soils, because they put all the houses on where you can get a septic field. Where you can put a septic field in your prime location for farming. So it's really sort of I don't know, it's good in theory.
Part of that's driven by the fact that the subdivision ordinance itself requires a certain amount of public road frontage.
Yeah.
So the developer's driven towards the public road
Right.
or build your own road.
Right, and it's much more cost effective to use an existing road, hence they put it on the front. So I guess my point is you're trying to legislate something that's gonna be impossible to legislate.
It's a difficult
It's
law.
Yeah, but it's not balancing well for the rural preservation, the visual rural preservation anyway.
Right. Well, except I don't think the alternative necessarily benefits the visual either, and at least out of this one, we get that large contiguous tract of land preserved. Because even if you take it out, you're still going to look to locate the houses along the road frontage to save costs.
Have there ever been any people who wanted to put big solar farms in here?
We have a solar farm in the Remington area.
Down around? Yeah.
Mhm.
I was wondering if county has done any thinking about climate change and whether we might do something to decrease the number of cars that we drive around. And like, for instance, extend the railway line from Manassas out to Warrenton.
It's been considered, the extension of VRE at different times. They've talked about touching into the northern part of the county, touching into the southern part, potentially extending to Culpeper. In many ways, that's a decision that's outside of the county's hands.
As long as they're state decisions, so.
CSX didn't play well with others.
It's also a double-edged sword in many ways, because the county,
The tracks and everything are there.
Yeah.
it's a double-edged sword to
Put a front of commuter train on the back of their freight trains.
it's a double-edged sword though as well. The county is trying to encourage more economic opportunities here and for people to be working here. And so if we make it easier essentially for that commute into Northern Virginia as well, you almost encourage more of a commuter population here you increase in many cases the residential development demand in this area as well. So again, it's a balancing act that the Board of Supervisors constantly have to juggle, trying to figure out where to walk that line.
Is it true that the rural lands plan is just a plan and a guideline and it has no real, it's not a tool for enforcement like a subdivision ordinance or anything?
Correct. The comprehensive plan as a whole is the county's guiding document for development and for its future. It essentially paints the picture of where we'd like to be going forward. It is not regulatory like a zoning ordinance, like a subdivision ordinance. It is used as an evaluation tool when we have legislative applications, so rezoning application, a special use permit, a special exception. Those are evaluated against the comprehensive plan for their conformance with it. It does also potentially lay the groundwork for amendments to the zoning ordinance or amendments to the subdivision ordinance, but it in and of itself is not a regulatory document.
When we sit in at the work sessions of the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisors, we hear them frequently reference the comp plan as to whether or not they're going to decide one way or another on situation after situation. And I've heard the comp plan called like the Bible of zoning, because that is basically where ordinances and everything are based on. That's basically a mandate of this is going forward, vision for the county that then ordinances and decisions and determinations are based on. And that, for example, if there is ever a court case where something is challenged, then it's my understanding, what I understand is that the judge would look at the comp plan. So in that sense, even though the comp plan, it's my understanding, is not an ordinance itself, it is the basis for ordinances and determinations and decisions going forward.
Yes and no, just like everything. The comp plan, as stated, is the county's vision. The zoning ordinance, the subdivision ordinance, all those different other things are then the tools and the mechanisms by which the county strives to achieve that vision. So when we have land use decisions that come up, those cases, those legislative ones that I said, they are required to be in conformance with the comprehensive plan. They are required to essentially show how these changes to the land uses that we have help to accomplish the county's and the community's vision for what it wants to be in the future. And the way that they do that is with the comprehensive plan. When we do see lawsuits and things like that, it depends what the nature of that particular lawsuit may be as to whether or not the comprehensive plan is invoked. But the comprehensive plan is by its very nature, a very broad and very vast document, because it is looking at the entirety of the county and trying to provide general guidance to an entire county. Obviously, when you look at specific parcels and specific land use applications that come in, there are going to be different parts of the comprehensive plan that come into play that may not always be in complete concert with one another. And so it's up to the Board of Supervisors, ultimately the Planning Commission making a recommendation, but ultimately the Board of Supervisors to weigh that application against the comprehensive plan and the different parts of the comprehensive plan to make the determination whether ultimately it is generally in accord with that comp plan and generally helps to accomplish that vision of the future that the county has laid out within the plan.
So am I correct in understanding that with this change of the comp plan, the county is eliminating the in-law suite option on certain properties?
This is not changing in any way, shape, or form the zoning ordinance.
Right, but I know, but I guess I think one of the things you said, removing tenant houses or something like that. What is that?
No. What that was in the 1995 plan, they had advocated for allowing multiple tenant houses as though you were subdividing the parcel without actually subdividing the parcel. That was never adopted. That was never put on the books in that same way. We're advocating not continuing that because there's a strong potential for that to be exploited, essentially with the concentration of those tenant houses in one portion of the property that you then subdivided off the remainder of the parcel, and so essentially saw far more residential units on that property than would be allowed.
Thank you. One other question. What are you referring to with the sliding scale and steep slope? You were covered a part of that. What are you referring to? How's the steep slope and sliding scale, what's that relationship?
There was a time when the way the yield with the sliding scale was calculated omitted certain land, certain acreages. That's been subsequently modified. So at one time they had omitted those steep slopes and other environmentally sensitive areas from the calculation, essentially decreasing the yield on the property. But it was determined at some point in the last 25 years that that was not appropriate and potentially penalized those property owners. And so that was removed.
And with the septic systems, wastewater systems, and the new environmental friendly ones that you're trying to promote with this comp plan, what percentage more expensive do you know are these systems versus the more traditional ones?
Well, to take a step back, I don't know that the comp plan itself is not promoting alternative systems. What it's promoting is the potential utilization of these alternative systems where a conventional system wouldn't work. What we had in the past was that if you couldn't utilize a conventional system, the traditional way of doing it, you couldn't necessarily do any development at all. So what we're advocating for now is with the advancement in technology of these alternative systems is to allow them to be utilized. So allow development to potentially occur where it couldn't occur in the past, particularly for where we're seeing a number of the traditional systems in cluster developments failing. What we're saying here is let's take a look, let's consider putting in a communal alternative system here to help remediate this situation where we have the failing systems, where we have essentially the wastewater flowing freely out of these properties. Let's try and address the health issues, similar to what the county has done in Catlett and Calverton, where the county actually has gone in and put in a system. In this case, it wouldn't be the county, but allowing a community themselves to go in and put in an alternative system, which is a system that wasn't envisioned 25 years ago, wasn't feasible. Allow them to potentially go in and put in a system that addresses all of their failing properties, all of their failing systems, to allow them really to continue to live there.
Would the setups for existing buildings in the villages, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So not new development, but basically to fix where people have, where they live now and have failing systems, to give them a way to correct it so they don't have to move.
For these communal systems, the alternative systems can be utilized on an individual basis, but we want to be very careful with these communal systems because we don't want to see the communal system become a way to increase development in the rural lands, but we do want to see it as an option to be able to help those out who are already there, who may have failing systems.
Is that something that was recently talked about? Is it currently being enabled in some situations throughout the county? I know you have referenced Catlett. Is throughout the county, do we currently have that option where they can come before the board or the planning commission and request a communal system?
There are, within very strict circumstances, and the board is right now has just recently adopted a new provision in certain areas to allow these communal systems to be utilized for existing structures. So it's something, again, that we're moving forward and moving toward allowing these systems, again, to address where we have the failing systems, because recognizing that it in some cases it's just not feasible on an individual property basis. Some of the lots that we've seen that have been in existence for a long time simply don't have the acreage on the individual lot with their existing failed system to put in any sort of new system. And so trying to find workable solutions for these properties this is one of the ways that we're saying could work going forward. Again, they're going to need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, and it's going to be involving working very closely with the Department of Health to try and come up with the optimal solution.
You had mentioned in the old comprehensive plan that they were gonna map the county water resources and aquifers. Has that been done?
It's currently underway right now. The county's in the middle of a 5-year agreement with the U.S. Geologic Society to look to map our aquifers and our recharge areas to be able to have a better sense of where our water is and where it's coming from. And so the extension of that is to know which areas ideally we need to protect so that we don't see the degradation of that water. Because obviously the more polluted the water is, the more expensive it is for us to have to clean it and purify it before it goes into the public system. So it's as I said, it's taking place right now. I mean, when this plan went through in 1995, if you look at it, they're still considering the impoundment areas for surface water, which the county has subsequently decided to move away from. But there's a map in there that shows the potential location of Auburn Dam and things like that. So I mean that in particular is an aspect that really needed updating. But it took us a while to get around to actually trying to map these water supplies. What we had been doing was simply compiling every time we had development proposals come in and they were submitting hydrogeo reports. It was essentially creating a library of hydrogeo reports throughout the county that you could kind of piecemeal together. But this study that's going on right now is a more wholesale approach, looking at the county, trying to better understand and identify where our water is and what we can do to protect it.
But that's not part of the comprehensive plan, it's part of something else, that work?
The work is separate and standalone. At such time that it's completed, we could certainly see adopting it into the comprehensive plan as an appendix to the natural resources chapter. Most likely would be the most appropriate location for it. But right now, as I said, it's still, I think we're in year 3 of 5, so it's still got a little ways to go and the final reporting to be done.
You mentioned at the end of your presentation, thank you very much, and realizing that the comprehensive plan paints things with a very broad brush. It's not a specific thing, it's a broad brush approach. But you mentioned it says we will not encourage or we will not allow, or the language may be wrong that I'm using, businesses that would adversely impact the character of the area. Besides that, what are the guidelines for that?
Ultimately, it's going to be the Board of Supervisors who decide that and determine that. Again, this is one of the difficult things of writing a plan that addresses the better part of 40,000 parcels that exist within Fauquier County. What's appropriate, what works on one parcel on this road may not work and may not be appropriate on another parcel on this road. What we try and do in a comprehensive plan is provide enough guidance and enough direction that the Board of Supervisors are able to take the merits of the application itself and what's being submitted and weigh it against it and see whether or not it meets the intent of the comprehensive plan. So really trying to evaluate whether or not if a property is, if a proposal is submitted on a small rural dirt road, but it's going to be generating 200 cars of vehicle traffic a day, well, that's not going to work. That's going to, you're going to see that road torn up in no time flat. You're going to see that cost then borne by all the other neighbors on it. You're going to have potentially people traveling that road at late hours that causing noise and lights and things like that. Well, that's not really fitting with a rural character, where something that's off of an existing road that has sufficient capacity for it, that would have generate that same one, that's situated in a relatively sparsely developed area, that may be appropriate there. Again, it's going to be a case of looking at things on a case-by-case basis, but this provides that general guidance, that general tool, that starting point to be able to evaluate, to have that conversation as to whether what's being proposed is appropriate or not. And this is just one chapter within the plan that is weighed and considered in that regard. You know, it's also going to then be weighed and considered against the natural resources chapter, the heritage resources chapter, the vision, depending on where. So there are a number of different aspects that go into it. You know, this certainly, as a land use chapter, is an important one in providing the guidance. But it does require interpretation by staff, and the planning commission provide a recommendation, and then the board make that ultimate interpretation and ultimate decision.
So the board is under no obligation, though, nor the staff, you know, to go along with this. If that's, well, we don't agree with that, so we're not gonna do it. You know, yeah, we wrote the document here sometime in the near past, but we're under no obligation to go by it. It's merely like, that looks really nice, but I don't think we want to do that.
I'd be careful. I mean, that's where you potentially get into the lawsuits that Ms. Wilkerson was referencing. If a locality is ignoring its comprehensive plan and land use decisions, it's
I
on
didn't
some.
say ignore, I just said they're under no obligation
Well,
to go by it.
when you're evaluating a legislative application that comes in, there are a set of defined standards and obligations, including conformity with the comprehensive plan, that you are required to evaluate. And so you would need to find some grounds that the application either did or did not conform to the comprehensive plan to justify your decision. So that's where that interpretation by the Board of Supervisors comes in. And again, this is where I referenced, there may be applications that come in that have conflicting guidance from the comprehensive plan. Some sections that may support it and some sections that may oppose it. And that's where it's up to the Board of Supervisors to weigh that and to weigh which section is going to trump another one. You know, we talk about rural economic development, but then we also talk about the need to balance that with the rural character. That's where they're faced with those tough decisions of what is appropriate and what is not. And this is the starting point of providing the guide, but then it does require that collective discretion and that collective decision by the Board of Supervisors as to whether or not the application meets the intent of the comprehensive plan.
And it's never easy. I guarantee it. We struggle with that all the time.
Regarding the easements and land use taxations, on page 12 of the draft, it says that in total, approximately 71% of the county has some form of protection from non-agricultural development through one or more of these preservation programs, with the vast majority of this acreage in rural areas. What is the county's end goal percentage of how much of the county they want preserved?
I don't know if the county has a specific number in mind. The goal is really the preservation of the rural character. I think that is something that so many county residents identify with and pride themselves on being Fauquier residents is that rural character. And so, you know, I don't know that there's a specific number that is an aspirational goal. I mean, that number right there is significantly higher than most other jurisdictions that I'm aware of. And I think it's a testament to the county's property landowners, to an extent putting their money where their mouth is, of saying we want to preserve the land and preserve this rural character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was surprised at how large a number it is, and I know there's a lot of dissatisfaction among people in the county with the PDR program because of what that does with tax revenue. And so with such a large number of the county already preserved, I guess I was wondering if the county is going to, you know, if there's a percentage that it'll reach where the county will say, okay, you know, this is a good number.
The PDR program in Fauquier County has saved the taxpayers thousands of dollars. If you don't believe it, just go east and see the large developments. We're gonna put up this big housing development. Oop, gotta have a new fire department. Oop, gotta have a new high school. Oop, gotta have a new hospital. Taxes went right through the
And again, that 71% is including land use taxation and the ag forces, which are not perpetual. So, you know, there's always the opportunity for those to evolve and move into some sort of perpetual easement.
Some of the concerns I've heard is that this language is very vague and kind of open-ended, so, there's a certain uncertainty and perhaps lack of clarity on where this could go. And then, also, it seems like many of these things are already able to be done or have been being done by the county. So, how would you sum up in a nutshell why having this rural lands, which is much more difficult to read than the existing 1995 chapter, what about this is so important that we need to have this right now in this language?
I think in large part, it comes down to we're moving forward here and we're seeing increased pressure for development in our rural lands. We've done a great job over the past 25 years of preserving our rural lands under the old chapter, and that's why we wanted to continue and carry over many of those policies into that first half. But moving forward, we need to provide appropriate guidance for what economic development we can see in the rural lands that is supportive. And that's really, I think, the crux of why we're advocating for the changes we're advocating for, is wanting to give, one, landowners, but two, the Board of Supervisors, that tool to be able to say, this is what we want in the rural lands. This is the type of development that we see fitting in with the existing development, but that will allow property owners to maximize the economic benefits from their land. And the existing draft doesn't really do that. The existing language doesn't really do that. It does a great job of speaking to land preservation and preservation of in main part, the agricultural industry within the rural lands. But it doesn't go any further because in large part, I don't think those pressures were being, the county was subjected to at that time. They weren't envisioning the proliferation of wineries and the fine line they walk between serving as wineries and serving as event centers, and the impacts that those have on the neighboring parcels when you have potentially 150 cars coming to a property on a Saturday night, and then celebrations into all hours of the morning. Those just weren't things that were being considered 25 years ago. And so this new step provides some guidance, again, not only to the Board of Supervisors, but also to property owners who are looking to try and see what the county wants going forward. How can they best maximize the economic development potential of their property and be supported by the county?
Aren't these businesses, though, that are proposed or that you were talking about, aren't we already pretty well controlling them? And don't we have special exception things now where the county has, good control over what they